Hi everyone. My name is Bandit. Teach at the university. I'm a curator for the Shin Gallery who help us with organizing this show. And not only that, we have AIA Honolulu who's been helping us, the Kokomo Hawaii, Bishop Museum, and all these different talented and well-respected group of people that I just want to have a moment to spend time with them. And they're the one that I highly respect, in our community. And the purpose of this show is just to be able to curate the show differently from just in the contained gallery at the university. We decided to come to 4th Street Mall because this is the place where, all this old building was once located and it just slowly disappeared. Not only the old building, but also the mid-century one. Not only the Renaissance design, but also the mid-century, also well kept here. So I just want to thank everyone for coming, in particular, the Chapman to allow us to have the everyone. Actually, this is the one that if I want to invite people at my house, and including all of you. So it's an intimate group tonight, and I just want to thank everyone again. Thank you.
Julie has this boyfriend on, and then I don't need to use that, so I know this.
So what I like to start off with, this is a shopping season. And when I run up and down 4th Street, I don't get that sense anymore. And if as an architect, I like to find a way to stimulate this idea, to bring it back again. What it once was. It's the only street that you can walk up and down. It's almost like a park, but somehow it's pretty late at night. And as a designer and architect, how can we do as a community to move forward together, bring the old to the new, and how we can integrate it. So I want to open up the discussion. We'll be starting with DeSoto, who come around here.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm DeSoto Brown, and I'm the HBC historian, and I'm the curator of the archives. And London asked if I would be the moderator of this informal group here. So what I'd like to do first is to pass the microphone for each person to introduce himself or herself and what your title is to all of us before we get started, so we know how to criticize you for what you say.
I got wired.
How come some people got wireless? Didn't we? I guess.
Guess I thought you needed a problem.
So my name is Todd Hassler. I'm a local architect. I'm a partner at Peter Vincent Architects. And I'm the incoming president of AIA Honolulu. And I am originally from New York. I've been in Honolulu for about 8 years. And right after moving here, I was drawn to the walking tours. And so I've been doing that. And out of all of the stuff I do for the AIA and really professionally, those walking tours are the most fun I have. They are just fantastic. Meeting, Kama'aina, a lot of tourists come to take those tours, and it's just fantastic. I love the interaction, and then how I introduce the tour is it's a historic architectural tour, but it really sorry, am I talking too long? This is just a quick introduction, right? But I love how just talking about the buildings and the architecture it really kind of outlines the history of Hawaii and the development here. So just inevitably, it turns into a history of Hawaii kind of walking tour. And I just love the connection, and we really try to emphasize the connection between the buildings and the styles and the architects and builders and all of that. So for me, that became, my biggest passion here, after moving from the buildings. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Carolyn. I'm a student at UH, so I'm at the School of Architecture. Bundit was one of my professors, and I helped with the exhibit tonight, so I really hope you guys enjoy it. No, I'm just really excited to be here to learn and to listen. As a student, this is a really exciting part of Honolulu for me because there are so many interesting buildings, and I wish more of my counterparts at school would come down here and we could talk about them more. So this is just the first step maybe to doing that and creating some awareness, and then hopefully creating some change, because this is part of our future, and as future designers and future architects, we need to be aware of what's going on in our backyard. So thank you.
Jack Gilmore, I'd like to welcome you to the site of the Hudson Bay Company. It used to be right on this corner. And when it went out of business, it became the Beaver Grill. And the weather vane on the top of the Beaver Grill, or the Beaver for the Hudson Bay Company, moved across the street to the Brewer Building. So just so you know where you're at, the Hudson Bay Company was here. I was a history teacher for 30 years in high school. And I mentioned when we got started on this that my recollections of Honolulu go back to the 1920s, even though I'm not that old, because Honolulu did not change much after the Depression. A couple of buildings got added during the war, but during that Depression period, there wasn't a lot of change. And then during the war, there wasn't a lot of change. And it wasn't until the early 50s that you began to get remodeling and changes and look around here. So, and when it was concerned about how to bring life back to 4th Street, and I would say get rid of the mall, because as soon as the mall went in, the homeless came in, and you didn't have the eyes on the street the way you did when cars were driving up and down. And if you look at the life over here at Bethel or New Wanu, you'll see that there's a lot more life going on over there than it is over here.
I'm wired here. Everybody hear me okay? So I'm Bill Chapman, and as Bundit kindly said, I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture, interim dean, but now in my 5th year, so it's getting longer. And I like to feel I have some credit for the beginning of this, because one day I got a call from Bishop Museum, and it was from not the social department, but the sociology department or the ethnology department, and they said, we have this model.
Oh, yes.
We have this model of the Hackfeld building, and would you be interested? So I said, well, I better go see it. So I went up there, and being a hack rat myself, and also having worked as a director of the preservation program at UH for 28 years before I became the interim dean, that was like a natural. And it was so nicely put together and everything, even though it had some of the look of a Lionel scale railroad building.
That's not a bad thing.
With the little cars and things like that. And it was kind of dusty looking, and the trees had lost some of their leaves. And so I brought it back, and I put it in I couldn't think anywhere else to put it in but the main entrance of the school, which is not really used as White Nose as a main entrance. It's like a alcove between June and Eva, really. And occasionally a student will wander through that area by mistake. It's not really, as John knows, it's not really a Beaux-Arts building where you have the main entrance that tells you where you're going to go. So I put it there, and I heard, like Carolyn said, a few grumbles like, what's he trying to do? Turn this into that's not the kind of architecture we do. So I knew that we don't do that kind of architecture. So then I've had this thought, the Bundit, and I said, maybe we'll do this exhibit someday. To me, it's always someday. And Funded like grabs it and like runs with it.
No, I came to Julia directly. I said, "No, I found it. Good way, go ahead."
And so Sunday we have an exhibit. So thank you, Funded, for running with this idea. So that was the beginning, and I'll let Don take over. Well, Don isn't wired.
Hello, my name is Don Hibbard. I do architectural history. I was not involved in this project as much as all the rest of the people. At all, I just Funded said, "Oh, can you come down and help me out a little bit?" So I did, off and on, but very off, more than on. And so I'm here more to just find out what's going on.
Well, we will call on you. I think, okay, so two things, I think we have two things to discuss here to sort of split this up. First of all, this is a historic exhibit, so a lot of these things, a lot of the photographs that you see here that are also in the pamphlet or the booklet came from Bishop Museum. Bundit asked if I could provide pictures, I did, and eventually Bundit said, I want you to do this publication, so it turned into me doing it, but that's all historic. And if you look at it, you'll see that I chose to focus on just one part of the history of Fort Street, which is retail, because this was the main shopping street for Honolulu, and it had all the best stores, the largest stores, etc. So for a long time, you had to come to Fort Street if you wanted to shop really at the best level that you could. This ended with the construction of Ala Moana in 1959, the opening of Ala Moana. And since then, Fort Street has turned into what it is now. But so, based on that, I think we can first talk about the history and then segue into what do we see happening in the future. So let's get started with that. And Jack and I are they were the old guys, but I think we were personally here longer, but everybody has some level of memory of Fort Street. My memory of Fort Street is I was born in 1954. So when I was 5, Ala Moana Center opened. So my time on Fort Street as the main shopping street was limited. My memories are coming to downtown to go mainly to the dentist and the orthodontist and to other doctors in the Alexander Young Hotel, which then wasn't a hotel anymore. But we did sometimes come down because my mother wanted to get something on Fort Street, and my main memory is driving around and around the block because you had to find street parking because there wasn't parking, which is why Fort Street lost all of its retailing in the face of shopping centers that not only had a ton of it, but didn't charge you for it. And that's one of the major things. So I remember a lot of this driving around. I also remember the stores that we did go into looking a lot more old-fashioned than things that I was accustomed to in shopping centers. I also do, however, and we both were just reminiscing about the Crest store, of which there are photographs in one of the panels, which I really liked going to because there was so much stuff. I wasn't interested in what most of that stuff was, but there was just such an abundance of it to look at and kind of marvel at that I enjoyed it. Well, Jack's older than I am, and he just bragged about it, so I'm not saying anything he didn't. But Jack, let's hear some of your memories of Fort Street.
Fort Street, as you mentioned earlier, you had the various business types down here. So as you went from this area of Queen Street up to King Street, it was mostly business or shops that were dealing with businessmen, like McInerney's was there for gentlemen to get their business suits and so on. And then from King Street to Hotel Street, that was the magic shopping section. And the corner of King and Fort was the most valuable corner in town. Truly valuable corner. I mean, everybody wanted that lot. And it was Security Diamond had a jewelry store there. I think it was the perfect thing. And then when you crossed Hotel, and Hotel in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even in the 70s was like a military playground. If you know Hotel Street, that's where it was all happening for the military. And they would parade from the O&O train station and walk Hotel Street all the way to the Y, which was right across from what is now the state capitol, or the Hawaii State Art Museum. So just to get a layout of how the city worked. When you went in Malka of Hotel Street on Port, the quality of the businesses began declining, although Crest was there, and that was sort of an anchor. And then you would go up to Beretania, it was still pretty good up to Beretania. Across Beretania, you had the Princess Theater, which kind of anchored that upper part of it. And when you came to town, you would probably come on one of the electric trolley buses that had leather seats. And they were quite comfortable and they were quiet and they didn't smell. And a lot of people just came by trolley because they didn't have cars. They didn't worry about places to park. And so the scene changed dramatically. I used to come down with my friends and walk around town. And we would go shopping at Liberty House and whatever. And there was a fabulous jewelry store called Nickman's, and you'd go in and they had all those shiny silver things and jewels, and it was like, wow. So that's the kind of glitz that was in that section between King and Hotel. Just wonderful stores. So that's sort of the sense that I had. And I definitely remember after 59, the whole energy just got sucked out of that upper part of the street. It's still held together down here because the businessmen are still here. They still needed a place to eat. They still needed a place to shop on their lunch hours.
Oh, and I was going to also say too, this was the site where the main stores, the highest quality stores, the best known stores have their anchors. So Jack just mentioned McInerney, Andrade, and Liberty House. Only people who are really old even know what those businesses were, but they were the premier businesses of clothing retailing in the Hawaiian Islands. So to come downtown to the major Liberty House department store and McInerney and Andrade, that was the highest level you could get. They gradually began to open branch stores in other parts of the city, but it was nothing like coming to the main stores. And that's what that was all about. And to concede, to try to even think of a time that they wouldn't even exist was inconceivable, because you couldn't imagine they would have gone away. You couldn't imagine that the entire sugar industry would have gone away either, but it did. And so the memories, the businesses are gone, the retailing is gone. However, as you mentioned, a lot of the buildings are still present, not all of them, but some of the buildings are still present. And when you talk about the buildings, you cannot help but talk about, as you said, who was in them, who used them, who built them. I mean, structures are inanimate things, but they are built by humans and they are inhabited and used by humans. So humans are part of the entire story. And so all of the buildings that are still here, when you talk about them, have human context, have human stories connected with them as well. And people who designed them, built them, lived in them, shopped in them, and whatever else in them. Anybody, Don, do you want to add anything to the reminiscences of 4th Street? Really? Not really?
I was here in 67. I was here in 67 at UH, and I did not venture downtown very often to this part of town. So, and then in 68, this became, or rather in 69, this became a shopping mall.
Yeah.
So I missed that transition because I left in June of 68. So.
Well, not exactly, but this is, okay, so now let's say, what happened after that? We've talked about it as the major shopping street. We've talked about some of the retailers on it. They began to lose customers, as I said, because of Ala Moana in particular, but other shopping centers too. And shopping centers, the first of what we would consider a shopping center opened in 1951, which is the Aina Shopping Center. And then from there, a lot of smaller ones were created as well. And so that, again, took away the life from downtown. It wasn't necessary to come to downtown. When that started to happen here, as well as in other cities all over the United States, the concept then came about of, if the downtown streets can't compete with shopping centers, then what we can do to the downtown streets in all these different cities is to make them like shopping centers. And that was the creation of turning major shopping streets in various downtowns into malls, like 4th Street Mall. Now, there are pros and cons to that. And I know in some cases, some cities have actually removed malls. I don't know that that's actually brought a lot back in terms of necessarily revitalizing. It's not a magic solution any more than building a mall. It's a magic solution, unfortunately. Cities always change. Things, neighborhoods rise, fall, get rejuvenated and everything. So there isn't any one magic way to make that happen. But what we have seen, and even after the mall was built, there was still a lot of stuff going on. It's just gradually gone away, and to the point that I'm kind of shocked now to be on 4th Street to see how little there is, because there's almost nothing happening at all. And if HBU didn't own most of it, I don't know what it would be like. In any case, now that we've talked about the old stuff, let's talk about ideas for what might happen. I'm not an architect, you're not an architect. We let the professionals tell us what they think because they know all the answers, don't they? That's right, you don't have.
Well, to follow up what you're saying, so I think across the nation in the 60s, 70s, when this concept of the pedestrian mall was coming about, you know, it was really brilliant, I think, at the time for them to incorporate it here, because if you look at a lot of the pedestrian malls across the nation, where now there's only, you know, 50 to 100 left out of the hundreds that were built, but this one's still here. And the ones that are still there, climate is a big factor, which, you know, here we have the best weather in the world, so that's good. There's always an association with a college, so we do have HBU, like you said, which is a home run. What was the other thing? Oh, and a big factor is water access to some waterway. So we have all of them. So it's not a surprise that, you know, this has survived as long as it has. As far as looking ahead, for sure, diversity is huge. You know, without HBU, what would be here? We have, if you step outside of 4th Street, there are some, you know, things that are available that would enhance if we're on 4th Street. You know, community centers. You know, we have Hawaii Theater, which is really great. That's starting to bring people. You know, when we have events at Aloha Tower, that's great. That's kind of a good magnet to kind of stimulate the thoroughfare here in 4th Street. But there's also a lot of things that, you know, you realize how remote 4th Street is when there's hullabaloo and when there's these real First Fridays kind of in town, you know, on Hotel Street, you know, 4th Street dead, you know, everyone's there. So there's this big disconnect. So I think the big pieces are really in place for the infrastructure is there. I think the connection with the culture, the buildings, and the history of 4th Street is a huge stimulant to what 4th Street could be. But I think diversity is probably the biggest thing lacking. You know, the high quality restaurants, the bars, residential, you know, access on the weekends. You guys all know it's just dead down here. I live up on Beretania, so. And I do a lot of running, so I kind of walk up and down 4th Street on the weekend. I mean, it's just completely dead. There's just no activity. So I think providing some of that, and there's a lot of pieces in place for adaptive reuse. You know, with COVID, all of a sudden everyone's now working from home. All these office buildings are empty. So what can we do? Well, if we convert these offices to residential, then we'll bring people back into the city, and there's a stimulant. So I think a lot of the foundation is here for sure, and there's a lot of opportunity for you know, reactivating, you know, down here.
Well, no, just to think out loud about, again, you're in the field of architecture. Are there any architectural things specifically that you think could address this situation on Fourth Street? And nobody's expecting you to say, here's how to do it, but I mean, are there thoughts that you have?
This might sound kind of cheesy, but I love the old buildings, so as long as we keep those safe, I'm okay. And maybe they can be part of the highlight of down here, maybe we can like highlight them in some way. I mean, we know we try to do that. They have the walks that you were talking about, which are great, but I don't know many people in my class who've actually taken one of those, to be honest, and maybe that's on us. But yeah, I would love, and people my age love to do First Friday, but you're right, it's down there, it's not on here, so maybe more events like First Friday to help draw people to that section. It would be nice to see more like arts and crafts, creativity too, or music.
I mean, Friday during the day, oops, sorry, go ahead.
Do these historic buildings have a sign and a history and that picture, black and white before and after, with stories?
Some of them have a plaque.
Uh-huh.
I actually helped do those.
I'm new,
Some of them
I'm new
do
here.
have plaques.
Yeah, those that are on the historic register have a plaque that's mounted on the front. But I was gonna say, Fridays when there's the market, in front of Walmart on Fourth Street, I mean, it's just fantastic to go there at lunchtime. It's packed, there's just people all over, vendors, and I mean, that's where it's like, well, if this could happen all the time, this would be really changing for downtown, so.
So I like your comment at the beginning, actually, because to me, the lifeblood of something like this would have to be there's the natural lifeblood of how people use the space, right? In vehicle travel, but proximity to being able to come and go through the area when you have a quick stop. The energy of a New York City street is all about vehicle, pedestrian, crossover, mixover. I think there's a sort of a stillbornness to what's going on now that is, I think when it was nostalgic to do it, it probably had a foothold for a little while. And when there was still a lot of pedestrian traffic, I think COVID and the wipeout of the retail industry in general is just taking it down to its knees. So I like your solution as a strategy to not preserve it like a monument. That's what it feels like down there now. And unfortunately, the only people enjoying it are the ones that probably shouldn't be there and are detracting from anyone else feeling like you could walk on. I used to work downtown. I don't work in it anymore, but I used to walk between I lived in Tunnel Park Place and walk to the Summer Park every day for 15 years probably. And it degraded so quickly that it was I didn't even want to walk back at night. And I'm a hockey player. I'm not too afraid of it. But things happen. In fact, my only experience in my entire life where I felt threatened to a point of being attacked was on the phone. At the phones. There were drug deals going on with the phones. And so I think we have to get over the idea of preserving and get back into the rejuvenation of it, bring it back into the city, bring it back into the lifeblood. Let the blood flow again, let's say, of the street. I think you're right on with that.
There are several things that this brings to mind. First of all, one of the problems or one of the major differences or changes that has happened socially and in the government in the time period that we're talking about was that 50 or more years ago, people who were on the street were either arrested and put in jail or they were committed to mental institutions, whether they wanted to be or not. And that is something that is a major shift in how society deals with people who are now homeless. So when we were kids, all of us, we saw very few homeless people. There were some drunks in some parts of town, but there weren't homeless people with shopping carts living in cardboard. And the only way that's going to be reversed is by a major change in legal perceptions of we can arrest you and we can commit you involuntarily even if you don't want to go. And that's a hugely complicating factor. The other thing I wanted to address too is one of the reasons for the mall, one of the rationales for the mall also was the mix of pedestrians and vehicles on Fourth Street. And I addressed this in some of the things that I provided for this was actually dangerous. People were injured a lot. People were killed by cars. People were killed when the streetcar used to run up and down Fourth Street, which it did from 1904 to the 1920s. So that was one of the things to control pedestrians and not put them in the way of getting hit by vehicles, because the vehicle will win. And the third thing that I think you will agree, Jack, is one of the major things that happened to downtowns was that the variety stores, which were found throughout the United States, the chain stores, so the Woolworth and the Crest and the National Dollar Store, but then all these other Kresge and stuff that was all over the United States, and they built their stores intentionally in downtowns, in big cities and small towns all across the country. They all closed. So that's major element of retailing, which people went to downtown specifically to go to, died. And when they died, they all were gone. So that was a major reason, I think, that downtowns in a lot of places, including us, lost a lot of what was going on.
I think that's true. But I think also Fourth Street had a change. It used to run all the way up to into New Wanu, and it got truncated at Beretania, and that was because Bishop Street actually took over. Bishop Street had a dead end up at Beretania, and then it was cut through with the Poly Highway. And in the process of putting in the Poly Highway, Fourth Street got truncated, and that took a whole lot of vehicle traffic that used to keep the whole area stimulated, because if you wanted to go to Newton Water, you would come to Fourth Street in order to do it. So you lose all that traffic, you lose all that, eyes on the street sort of thing.
Does that make the logic that New Water becomes a new Fourth Street? Because New Water continues up. I don't,
New Water has traffic.
that's what I mean, but
Yeah.
it becomes a new Fourth Street, a new Fourth Street and a revival.
Well, it certainly has more activity, and that's where I say, if you want to get activity back here, you have to turn it back into a street, because it's.
But it would still be abbreviated because of its.
That's true, but I mean, it's still functional.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about HPU used to anchor the upper part of Fort. Now it's moved down here. And so you've got the water and the college down here. And so, what's going on up this way. So it progressively dies the further you go, Malcolm.
Another thing that made a big difference in the level of vitality in downtown was urban renewal. Well, several things all happened at the same time in the 1950s and 60s into the 70s. And that was nationally, the federal government was funding the construction of the federal highway system, meaning the freeways. So the freeway was put through Mauka of where we are, through what had been inhabited downtown. And that's a huge swath that was destroyed. Then the continuation of Poly Highway, which went over what had mostly been Fourth Street. And then at the same time, the widening and straightening of Vineyard Boulevard into a 6-lane medial strip highway, essentially. And then urban renewal. And urban renewal was, again, federally funded, in which areas in cities which were deemed to be depressed or slums, as they were called, were literally every bit of private property was condemned. Everybody was moved out. Everything was literally bulldozed, and then you built one complex that took up the entire block. So that kicked out tons of residents, and it kicked out tons of small businesses, which were just Mauka of where we are. So there were a tremendous number more people doing things that they literally, and the tragedy was, these people were moved out of what was admittedly substandard structures, but they weren't given another place to live. And when they were given more places, they were either widely spaced high rises, or they were well-ordered, smaller concrete buildings without the vitality of multiple small retail stores. So that makes a huge difference in the level of life as well.
And that area north of Beretania was very dense and populated. 3, 4-story walk-ups, wooden structures, people without cars. When they wanted to shop, they had to come into town. And so you had a huge traffic potential coming in that direction. As soon as you do the shopping center with lawns and Safeway or whatever it is up there on Poly Island, on Vineyard. You know, that sucks a whole lot of energy into that area. Urban renewal on this upper end of Fourth Street and over to Bethel and you know, that could revitalize things, but it would be important to save the historic structures because there's some beautiful buildings in that area. You don't want to clear cut the block the way it was done in Mount Coast, but to bring residences in, and you'll see the city doing that in some places where they'll condemn a certain lot and they'll put in some public housing. But you need to get middle class housing in here, or it's not going to flow.
I have my own mic.
Yes, you do. I'm very jealous.
But I'm enjoying hearing it, and it was nice to hear that Jack used to regularly go to the Hudson Bay Company and pick up your dried salmon there.
Restaurant in the
Well, you know, that's the source of the loamy salmon we have as a native dish in Hudson Bay Company. They used to import dried salmon, so. You know, I used to tell my daughters, I raised two daughters, and I said, you know, going to the shopping mall isn't like like an urban experience. And because they never had anything else. Now, of course, the shopping malls are failing. Luckily, ours aren't yet, but you know, all this living, I would think. And again, it's the kind of e-commerce, I guess, is putting that out of business, which is incredible. So, because I really do value it. I invited Ed Krivsky to come. I don't know if any of you know Ed, but he's the manager for Fort People. And he worked with First Friday before, and he's been really, he came on the Docomomo tour. And he's a fund of knowledge, but I think he has to do with a bunch of little kids, and he's probably busy on a Friday night getting ready for Christmas. But, you know, he's done a lot, and he did kind of create that plaque program. I think they got a grant from Preserve America to put up the plaques. It wasn't just listed buildings, it was just ones we could find. And so that was interesting. And you know, I always look at the photo of Honolulu taken like in 1957 from the air. And it was like if someone had the wisdom at that point to kind of go the European route and say this is a central historic area, we need to preserve it, we need to do some swapping out, we would have one of the nicest cities in the world. It'd be like Genoa or something, but we lost it. And it's too bad. I did want to comment a little bit on the idea, you know, in England, they've done a lot of experimentation. If anybody's been there recently, where they actually get rid of sidewalks. They find that, you know, technically, I guess statistically, you're more apt to get run over by a car if you have a sidewalk to fall into it, because cars begin to assume that they have that's theirs, right? But if you have complete streets in a way that just take the paving right up to the front, you can actually, cars can share space with pedestrians. And they do that a lot in England. And I agree, there are very few shopping malls that have been successful. For some reason, the one where I did my undergraduate degree in Charlottesville, Virginia, seems to do well. I don't know why that one does well, but I, throughout my career, because I did some of my career in the Maine before coming here, I would run into these really sad pedestrian problems. Sometimes they put up canopies of things to kind of make it even more. So I think it was like a number of cities in Massachusetts did that. Birmingham, Alabama did that. It was sad, but my first professional job was in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. And there was an old, we used to call him an old pirate named Isidore Paiwanski. And if anyone's ever been to Charlotte Amaya, there's a store called Reese's. And it was an old Danish establishment. Isidore's family came over in like the 1880s and bought them out. And we used to talk about, wouldn't it be great to have a pedestrian wall? This was in the 1970s. And he said, no way do you want that. It drives people into the stores. The constant movement of traffic creates a dynamic that makes people want to sometimes get away from the traffic or the taxis going, taxi, taxi, back to the ship, back to the ship. And they would run into the store. Now, the other thing they did wasn't very progressive, is they also had the doors wide open and blasted out air conditioning. They said it's still economic, despite losing all that, to not have people have to open the door, they walk right in. So it's interesting, the movement of people came off. So, Don, and taking up some time, your turn.
Yeah, I don't know. You're talking about Port Street Mall, but most of the area around here is pretty dead at night. It's not just Port Street Mall that's dead. And certain retail has found a niche down here. You have places for lunch to support all the people at work. So I think that is it's not the retail that used to be here at all, but the retail that used to be here is pretty much nowhere.
Exactly.
And so I think to try and recreate that energy, you cannot. That what you need to start thinking, okay, well, this is the energy that's been created now. And either start working with that, or how do you expand on that? Sure, I think they've tried to expand, get people to come down for dinner. But no, people go somewhere else for dinner because they live far away. And so I think part of it is, like you were saying before, just the critical mass of residential in the area. And as long as that's not here, it's not going to be happening at night.
I think the issue is, safety, parking, all those things have a big impact on why people come. Mind you, the sort of that idea of just getting people off the streets. I asked one of our Chinese students, I said, I never see homeless people in China. What happens? They said they take them away somewhere. And that's really, to my mind, scary. So I don't want to go there at all. They need to find a better solution to that.
But that was, people were taken away somewhere. And that's the way it worked. And it was a joke that there were chronic drunks who would get put in jail every night and get out every day and drink and then go back to jail every night. Because that's they didn't have to work. They got a free place to stay. And again, it was much easier to commit people to mental institutions, which then led to abuses, which is one of the reasons why it's now not easy to put people in mental institutions. Yes.
Now it's Windward College.
Is that where they go?
No, but that's what that was our mental
Oh, yeah.
institution. We don't have those anymore.
I was born and raised in Minneapolis, which is Southdale Shopping Center, the
Yeah.
first full-blown indoor shopping center. And Nicollet Mall is the ultimate of that, yeah. But the issues what you're speaking of, it's shopping malls were generally created for safety and control of that public space. So when you have a no-owned public space like we have out here, or any street, basically, that's our biggest problem right now. The in-between space that isn't owned by anyone, no one has the obligation to take responsibility on private sector, so it falls in the public sector, which means it really can't be supported 24/7, right? And that isn't getting any easier, it's only getting worse. We're not gonna solve this problem by chipping people away or bringing laws to get them not to lie and not to sit and not to stand and not to walk and not to, run, whatever. So it seems to me that we've entered a complete paradigm shift now. There is no, you have to ask the question, why are people even gathering on the street anymore? We basically, at times, forcing ourselves to go out to gather on the street for very limited reasons, and then only for very limited times of the day. So it's a real quandary, really. I mean, it's not like we are getting closer, we're getting much farther away from the solution.
And I would also say too, that one of the situations is it cannot be a single entity that creates the whole new thing. Because it's mostly independent businesses that are doing this. And there has to be a synergy and an energy to get, and it's organic and it develops on its own. And you happen to get 2 or 3 successful businesses together, they will become an attraction and they will lift up everything in terms of people coming and so on and so on. But it isn't something that you can decree. And I think everybody knows that when you design something or you create something and you think everybody will walk through here and then they'll turn right, then they don't. It's like what you just said, people don't walk the ways you think they're going to. And so it isn't necessarily possible to create the ideal situation that you fantasize. Once you build it, they will not necessarily do what you thought they could. Yes.
So there's a lot of opportunity, in my opinion, to activate the streets, especially 4th Street Mall. And there's a lot of businesses that actually are open late, right? Like along Hotel Street, all the restaurants. So what are the type of challenges that we're facing in order to activate this or create it more to increase the likelihood that people will interact with it? Because you look at the afternoon times when they have the markets and they have the farmer market. There's a lot of activity there. People are engaging with it, and it is a very pedestrian-oriented space. There's a lot of bus routes here. You have salt really close by, and you have all of these, Howard Hughes towers increasingly popping up more and more. So, like, what are the challenges we're facing in reactivating the mall? Because it used to be a very, successful mall.
I don't know if it was Jack or sort of who said it, but the housing, I think we need to have more people living downtown. It's the key.
And hotels, I mean, where are our hotels? They're not downtown. And so people spill out of hotels into a street. In New York, you have people living in the city, you have people visiting the city and walking the streets, and you have that vibrancy. So we have one whole component of living that isn't here. And we don't have viable living spaces on this side of Beretania Street. And so we're just sort of like, what's going on? It's a question.
Yeah, it sounds like this conversation is all about programming, right? And so, but what architecturally, what are things that we control that would be possible for us to change to create a tipping point or more energy, because I'm sorry the manager isn't here, so he could maybe help us understand what the programming mix is, what they're looking to fill these spaces with, and like we could tell him what he should be doing. But in terms of architecturally, like what are the opportunities, that we can do?
I think you could probably do some enhancement of historic buildings, like back to Carolyn's point. I think it's tragic that the last remnant of Sacred Hearts is being torn down. I think there's a picture of it somewhere, but and that's going to change the scale of the street there as well. And there are a few buildings like I always call it the coffin window building that actually could be pulled back from the brink. And so I think there's a lot of facades there. I think demonstration projects could perhaps begin. I mean, that's within the limited context of what we're talking about, not bringing people down. I think Los Angeles is a good example. They're really starting to revitalize downtown Los Angeles. Interestingly, I went on a tour once and the guy tried to tell me that Broad Street was a reinterpretation of the Spanish word for a wide street. And I looked it up a moment later and I found out it used to be called Fort Street. And they changed the name because they could never tell if anyone was living on 4th Street or 4th Street, especially once you had a lot of German immigrants. And they thought about Market Street and then they said, no, San Francisco's got Market Street. So they're actually putting in a streetcar on Broadway. Broadway's gonna have a streetcar. And I think that's gonna probably do a lot to kind of like generate more activity.
John.
Yeah, I think you really need to bring the sort of fine grained transportation planning into the conversation. And because immediately I was struck by remembering when a couple times I've been in Minneapolis, just like mall, it's a very pleasant place, but it also tames the car problem, but leaves the like rail or trolleys or something. Better if it's not noisy like the old fashioned trailers. So, really, that and people like that. It's a matter of maybe throwing out the baby with the bathwater with the shopping malls. It could be like a silo, horizontal silo in itself, And similarly, housing projects, there are some housing projects nearby in Chinatown, and there's the Harvard College, I think that's the name of it, and a couple more not far from here. But what you end up with, because of focusing on, oh, the car problem, you don't wanna have, the people that have all these cars and stuff, stack all these cars, some floors. And, the lower floors, actually, the kinds of floors where if you had people living, they would be more likely to be on the street, but when you've got the buffer, all this stuff, elevators up and down and what have you, it's just not working. Like,
Following up from my wife here, we have been fighting rail for years. And we're trying to advocate that rails stop at Olive Park. And that we do a trolley down Hotel Street all the way to Thomas Square, because that easement is there. And you can go with trolleys right through between the Capitol and the Palace and City Hall. I mean, we're trying to get the rail into the Civic Center, right? So why not just get off the rail at the old railroad station, which is down there at Olive Park, and get on a trolley where you can see the street. I mean, Hotel Street would be totally revitalized, and you'd get the spillover Malcolm Mackay from that, and it could be a wonderful thing. And our wonderful planners, they just could not comprehend that. And so now we have this weird thing stopping down on where is it stopping down?
Yeah, and also then there could be something like a loop that goes around Chinatown, Orange Street, using this, and you can start to envision all kinds of things.
Well, what you just said about the buffers of the multiple
Yeah.
parking levels, I think is another really important thing too, in that if you go to densely populated Manhattan, you've got lots and lots and lots of 5-story buildings all lined up. So all of those people come down directly on the sidewalk and start walking. All of those, the ground floors of every one of those buildings has got multiple businesses, and they all have street traffic all the time because everybody's able to walk right to them. And as you just said, it's right in their faces. So the vitality is there, as opposed to widely spaced high rises with big parking plinths in which there is nothing to walk around for. You come down and go out and you're walking or driving to another specific place, not walking along and saying, oh, I could go in here or I could go in there. There is no there to go into.
I'm gonna chime in. I think it's a multifaceted issue, and I'm not sure if we're beating around the bush because I don't think it's a transportation issue. As a young professional, like I find myself in Chinatown all the time. You see First Friday, that brings a lot of activity around there. You're not gonna revitalize the space by increasing hotels or residences because the price point for these units will be far too expensive. Nobody's gonna live there.
4th Street. Price point.
Regardless of where you live in Chinatown, it's expensive. You have these terrible units in Quick Grove, I mean, that's what it used to be called when I was growing up, but then, AHL is doing a project, doing the executive center, the old HBU. And I'm not sure that's necessarily gonna bring more people in because they're gonna be really expensive units, first of all, it's gonna be rental, probably transient, and sure, you get a lot of engagement with transient populations because they're here visiting, they're gonna check out the life, but I think there's more to it. And I think what Willem might have said too is a programmatic thing. And why is it not, and maybe someone touched upon it earlier, which why don't the businesses open later? You only have the restaurants open later. So I think there's a bigger layer that we're maybe not hitting on, because I don't think it's necessarily transportation, because I find myself in Chinatown all the time, regardless if I'm working or if I'm here for entertainment or to socialize.
I don't think it's just one thing. I think that's the thing. It is multifaceted. I think you're absolutely right. So none of these things is necessarily, again, as I said earlier, going to be the magic touch that revitalizes. It's going to be a whole bunch of different things created by different entities, the government, private source, whatever, and good luck. Because again, you cannot force things. You can think it's a sure thing and you can create it, but it's not true that if you build it, they will come. They don't necessarily come. Martin.
Bill was calling out on these German immigrants.
You're not saying anything bad about the Germans.
He wanted me to say something about that.
For Martin sitting there still scratching his head.
Yeah.
What's the difference Free board and board.
So there are also other European immigrants. So like in talk, I think you had there was a good sparking here with the times, because when my son came from swimming, like, and it started to be 8, we had a hard time finding a place to eat something there. These Portuguese people here, whenever you are in Spain or in Portugal, when you go to a restaurant like before 9, it's fairly empty. And once you come back after that, it starts to fill up. So I'm asking everyone who has been here longer than me, which doesn't mean much. Where does this culture come from? Is it still like from the pre-contact days where you had to like call it good when the sun went down and to be up early to go fishing, or?
I mean, Honolulu was, no, literally, Honolulu was notoriously early rising compared to other American cities for a long time, and I think still is. But, you know, if you come downtown in 1950, you would have found a whole bunch of stuff open and thriving till late. So there were restaurants open all the time. There were bars. There was, again, when this was the main place to come, all of that was there because people came to it, patronized it, and it was functioning. There were tons of little businesses, tons of little restaurants and things that just aren't here anymore.
So there is no law that says you gotta close down by a certain time?
No. Oh, well, there are, yeah, I mean, bars have to close at certain times. No, there aren't requirements. We did have Sunday closing laws.
Yeah, but the dining late people, you know, live in hot countries and they take siestas. And so, you know, it's a whole different kind of thing going on.
Yeah, we did see
Yeah.
It
We
makes
get started.
It makes you wonder why we never thought to have people from Portugal move to Hawaii.
But they had work in the fields. They didn't get to take a siesta in the sugar fields and pineapple fields.
I don't think restaurants stay open because they don't have the customers. In fact, I agree with everything everybody has said. I mean, it's like everything, right? I mean, it's you, of course, if you had more people living downtown, you'd have more customers. That's undeniable, but as I pointed out, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but like you pointed out, that would make I mean, it's hard to do that. Now they're doing it in Kaka'aka, but that serves a different type of audience, and also that's not entirely inhabited either. A lot of that's investment property. And I doubt that's gonna happen downtown, but.
I think you can see in that Howard Hughes' investment is so staggering large. Bigger than anyone else's landowner's investment in anything like that. It's taken that 15 years now of that kind of level of investment and continued investment to create a critical mass of whatever it is that they're bringing in, you know, foreign invested, part-time living, you know, like high valued lifestyles. And it still has a pretty good one, but it's actually attracting locals. And it's attracting because of its high quality, right? So I feel in this conversation, what dawned on me was, we haven't really ever decided, are we trying to build this for locals? Or are we trying to actually turn it into a destination for an offshoot of the tourist industry? It's kind of stuck in the middle. I mean,
They have to be both.
I think you have to make a conscious decision that you're going to take it deep into the tourist experience.
I don't think it needs to be
Yeah,
both.
previous conclusions we've reached when I was working on programming with other developers is you build it for locals and that will automatically attract visitors.
That's what New York, I mean, New York really depends on tourists.
But you have a typical mass that ends at like 5 p.m.
Yes,
4 p.m.
exactly.
here, so like, I oftentimes work past 2 p.m., which everything closes, and I can't even find anything to eat, and I'm still working, so I don't understand where the programmatic, or operational things,
And then you need to
come
go to
from.
bed by 9.
That's why you can't use the local model as that driver, because we're not living that local lifestyle of living on the street till 10 p.m. at night because we are so close to it and it's part of our everyday lifestyle. So you kind of have to decide if you're creating your own sort of Ford Street, Mall, Diddling World, streetscape for the tourists to come in and experience some level of a local community activity. It's not one we're all excited about, certainly, but
I think one of you mentioned salt. I think salt is a really good example of what I was talking about in terms of success. That they put it together, but people had to like it and go to it. And people do like it and go to it. But is there something special about it, different from everything else that, could you put your finger on it? Could you define it? I bet you couldn't. The other thing is, as we have seen very clearly in this entire discussion, you could be riding high in April and shot down in May, just because things change in ways you cannot anticipate and in ways that you can't even define or understand. It can be hot right now, and 6 months from now, everybody's tired of it because we've all been there once or twice, and now we don't want to go there anymore. So we never know.
and salt is a postage stamp.
I know it is, but the fact that people actually go to
No, but
it,
it's a postage stamp, and everything around it is not like salt.
exactly,
I work right across the street, I go over there for lunch probably once a week, but
right,
it's got a very short span, it's just a block, right?
it is,
You got 5 of those going down Fourth Street Mall, basically.
right,
And that's.
right. But the thing is, you can't, my point about salt is, there was no way to know whether it would really work or
Right,
not.
no, it
And it has worked. It hasn't worked for everything because there's been turnover.
second floors don't work.
Second floors don't work in Waikiki either. I've lived in Waikiki, they don't work anywhere. But regardless of that, salt took hold in a way that you could never be absolutely positive it would. So that's a really good lesson as to, we might make this block as beautiful as we think it could possibly be, and people still might not come.
I think it comes down to kind of what Willa was talking about. How can we solve, because a lot of this is still problematic and trying to figure out what's gonna work and what's not, but architecturally, so how can we solve this architecturally? And it, this thought comes from Chris from SCV, who's working on one of the high rises down here, converting the office to residential. He's challenging and saying, well, look, if you're designing a new building for a specific use, in 20 years, that may be a totally different use. So how can we design for that flexibility and allowance for ease of, adaptive reuse? So, architecturally, rather than saying, okay, we're gonna make, a walk-up townhouse here and that's it. Well, then that's gonna be like that forever. So how can we design it in a way that allows that flexibility for the unknown, the unknown, what's gonna happen across the street and allow that.
And when you look at the historic buildings and you look at the parade of businesses that have been through some of these single buildings, it's been a shoe store, it's been a drugstore, it's been a doctor's office, it's been, all of these things happened in a building that wasn't even built to, that nobody thought anything like that was gonna happen, but it did. So.
I don't know, one of the problems I think too is that you don't have a stock of building types that, like say Los Angeles, where they had a lot of office buildings, older hotels and things that they could rehabilitate and make into housing. We never had that. Have a stock of old warehouses or anything like that. I remember when they were working so hard to try to allow for housing in Chinatown, there was a scattering of places that were actually candidates for that anyway. So that's one of our big problems, and because in Los Angeles, they have the mill pact and things like that that can help subsidize the cost of rehab and make it more attractive. You don't have that stock. So I don't know what we do as a solution.
Well, could an architecture design studio take on a block or 2 blocks up here in Court Street, figure out which buildings to save that could be adapted, reused, try to figure out how to put housing within the buildings that need to be removed. In other words, new housing. So you have an architectural project of trying to figure out how to make a block work as a living and commercial space using a real block downtown. How would that work?
I think it all starts from an economic model, which none of us have experienced. And that's the bottom line. We all work with developers and we know that they laugh at us when we start dreaming too early before they've given us an economic picture. And then, you think you're gonna do a 2-story walk-up, and they're telling you it's gonna be a 40-story high-rise, because that's the only thing that will economically pencil in this situation, so. I mean, as much as we love to believe architecture drives the engine, it's really follows, it follows after the pro forma of an economic reality shows up. So, fixing up the old buildings is a whole different issue, you know, keeping them, preserving them. But the driver of what will make this work is the developers pro forma, like at Howard Hughes level, that says, yeah. We need subsidies, we need the government involved, we need this, we need that, and the economic model looks like this, and I'm gonna need to put up 6 high rises.
So how about an urban renewal program that's got the government in there with the money?
I mean, if this was a high enough priority neighborhood, that would be, I think it would be happening.
Well, we don't do urban renewal anymore, do
Yeah.
we? Because we don't have the funds, we don't have the social interest in our country anymore to actually try to make housing livable. So it's a political shift that we need as well.
Or one that is coming back perhaps because of this dynamic we're in, but it's not gonna come back the way it's gonna be. We gotta give up a lot more leverage to developers who have a lot higher opportunity.
And the urban renewal of the past was literally, we will bulldoze, we'll nuke everything,
Which,
because we must destroy it.
Yeah.
It must be destroyed in order to save it. So there was, I mean, that's why historic preservation got started. That's why we have a Chinatown, because Nancy Bannock and a few other people in the 1960s said, wait, you're not going to bulldoze every old building in downtown Honolulu. We're going to stop you. So it was in the face of that nuclear destruction. That's what that came from. So yeah, we're not going to go back to that 100%. And we also, I think, or at least I consider, the idea of super blocks in which you bulldoze every small building and build 2 high rises with a big plinth, and this is clean, sterile, modern, desirable, in terms of livability and what it does for the neighborhood around it, is not good. It doesn't help. So that isn't the model that should be happening anymore. But as you said, economically, maybe that's what the person who's going to pay the bills is going to say, no, we have to do it this way because otherwise we can't do that.
that's the kind of thing. That what we dream of in a romantic sense, exactly, our city doesn't imagine economic sense.
I don't know, maybe someone knows more than me, but I was hearing they were gonna put a hotel on the block right up on 4th Street where Fisher, Hawaii was, you know, they're kind of.
I think on Baratania, there is something.
So there's a wild card. It's like, what? Okay, all of a sudden now we're gonna have a hotel in here. You know, we had a hotel on Bishop Street, you know, and now it's gone and now we're bringing it back. So
It's under construction.
that's kind of that's gonna be an interesting test on what does that do to downtown, you know, because now there's a brand new use in town. Now all of a sudden there's a new hotel. So I thought the pandemic kind of stopped that project.
According to Ed, he said it's underway.
Is that right? Okay.
It's just the block down at
That's
4th Street. Right?
That's right, yeah.
Well, I would say, first go through and find all the places where housing can be tucked in to some buildings. But maybe there's a hard to find that area involved too far gone, but you know, something like that can be reused in a creative way. For instance, I read that the current mayor has gone around her city doing just that in order to get more housing without, you know, the bulldozing approach. And less expensive. I'm sure you can gentrify for very wealthy people, but you can also imagine do things for middle class people at the same time, you know, so.
Part of it, Dan, I think too, it goes back to who drives this. I don't think we ever have this upper hand where we can say, how shall be housing and stuff. It really comes from the individual owners ultimately, and or as you were talking about cities. I used to tell my planning class, developers build cities. Planners don't. They try to ride the tiger, I guess, and figure out how to make it work.
So right now you have much more of a critical mass of interest at the state and at the city level. You know, really, then I've been here 50 years, you know, and it there's more of that now than every time I've been here.
I think the mayor's interested.
Yes, that's right.
But they are looking at private
And-
development. All they
And,
can
and
do
people
is
say,
not really have
well, you know, diminishing farmland isn't a great idea. In fact, back even before statehood, you know, starting in 1967, the whole resort planning effort here in the state, was focused on and led by some architect and landscape architects too. With the planning of the resort areas to be limited to places where you had reasonable access to existing infrastructure without road expansion, without creating. Just so, you know, it's rocking every single beach, some of the ABC, this kind of approach. So I think actually, Bundit, to your credit now, you see you've gotten some energy here tonight.
No, it's them.
That reflects a bit of what I would say is just, you know, the architects, landscape architects, and planners should take and try to address that.
It is interesting looking at the past, though, when architects are trying to take the lead, and part of that is why we have what happened. And then civic center movement, and when planners took the lead, and in a way, if they, somehow we had that expertise involved, it may have evolved in a different way altogether.
Well, you do it and then you find out what works and you find out what doesn't work. But by the time you've found out what doesn't work, you've already built it, yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna, you know, follow that up with, you know, as someone who lives in the area and works in the area, you know, the first 7 years I was here, I didn't have a car, so I walked every, so I'm really passionate about using this area and, you know, for everything. And on the weekends, when everything's closed, there are a few, very few restaurants and bars that are open for like brunch on mostly Sunday morning. And, you know, my wife and I, we walk down there and it's packed. It is packed. There is a demand for people that, you know, and everyone's in their PJs, you know, it's Sunday morning, so, you know, but there's no one drove there. It's people that live in the area and they just walk down their Sunday. So it's like, okay, well, you know, what are these people doing Saturday during the day? What are they doing Tuesday? What are they doing Thursday? I mean, they have this drive to kind of, you know, not drive anywhere and use what's around here, but I think there is a, you know, people really have a passion for wanting to, you know, stay close to home and kind of have a.
These are in some places you're thinking of?
They're mostly bars.
There is a chain. There are a bunch of in some places.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're staying.
Right, they didn't close.
They didn't close, the bar patrons are still in there.
Yeah, right.
On the bar stools, yes, Martin.
I'm gonna throw in something even more weird, and this goes back to the German immigrant. German,
We shared Oktoberfest with the white.
Yeah.
You know, I'm German
Yeah.
sympathetic, right?
Yeah. Because everything that I see, and now we have the interesting images moving there, but when I'm looking at the previous one, it really calls home, because that's like, yeah, this one, thank you, that's like, well, that's brutalist.
That's the same, this is the same view, by the way, 1941 and
Yeah.
1968,
And both,
same location.
both look very European, if that's fair to say, as a model, right? I mean, there's the car, there's the street, the styles of the buildings are mostly sort of borrowed or imported from, right? So then I'm thinking, wait a minute, from that European perspective, there must have been a past before that past, which we haven't heard about, right? But most of this was just jungle, right? So where did,
Not generally, but it was, because it
With dry.
was more dry,
Dry.
yeah.
but where did that go? I mean, that's the question from talking tourists or visitors coming here. And I think, if that's fair to say, I think one wanted to be like up to pace with always the trends, right? Of brutalism having been the one that was in fashion, you know, in the 70s. And before that, the different styles, But how about that, what it sort of originally was, or what it still is? At the beginning, we heard it's the place where it's always summer, right?
But
So where's the vegetation, for example, that doesn't lose its leaves, as where this all comes from, right?
And actually, this scene now has a lot of trees. The
Yeah,
way it looks here is, it's empty, and when you're on Fourth Street Mall now, there are good sized trees, which on one hand are very nice, but on the other hand, you lose the urbanity of the setting in a way that's not always, it doesn't necessarily add to the vitality. Because there are no signs, there's not a lot of stuff.
I don't know, I mean, Joey, by the way, was most impressed with brutalism and the green. And that in combination was, okay, this is tropical exotic, but in an urban way, right? So I think I'm just saying, I'm always amazed by, when I go over the poly all the time, there's always a lane closed because they're like trying to keep nature under control, right? Because nature wants to thrive. And I'm saying that, I mean, from a scientific point of view, there's the heat island effect, right? Everything is radiating and it is pretty hot in here. So how about if we don't have any representative of our landscape program that we have in school, by the way? So I think these colleagues might be involved as well as to think about what role can vegetation play in, and vegetation isn't necessarily such an effort as, to the investments of a built environment that we were talking about.
Perhaps it's a wayfinding issue. I feel like that's probably a big issue in downtown, is a wayfinding issue. You don't really, I mean, I was born and raised here, I've spent, more than 30 years here, so like, yeah, I don't even know how to navigate, downtown all the time, but I think that's something that we can look at more, is how you wayfind through downtown, make it more accessible and more interactable and engageable with people, because it's all seems like this ubiquitous storefronts, low rise, that you don't really know what's where and where to go. So Martin's point, maybe you add a little more trees, certain ways to help to navigate.
Identify Fort Street as Fort Street.
But conversely, also too, I would say in the picture on that side, which is 1941, that is a very bustling, vital street. And one of the reasons it's bustling and vital and looks like that is that there are lots of signs, so that there's a lot of visual interest. By the time Fort Street Mall occurs, it is a lot more sterile. So it is not quite as engaging. And so there are places, I think, that where it is appropriate for an urban area to look like an urban area and have the vitality of literally blinking signs, displays, movement, etc. Times Square in New York is mandated to have signs legally. So there is there's that too, which does add to the life of a place.
I would like to continue that. It's about scale, right? When you're moving through a space, you see like Saturday, the Ford building. It's about scale in which you interact. That you see vehicles need a blinking lights to keep people. But to your point, there is nothing that engages pedestrians. So there's not a good wayfinding experience, and there's not enough scale reference to the point of travel. It's not a vehicular space anymore, it's for pedestrians. So how do we?
No, I agree with you, but again, one of the things that's happened, and Bundin and I have talked about this, is that you've lost, because of structures and because of trees, the vista of Fort Street that existed to look down to Aloha Tower as a point of visual reference, and to look to the mountains as a point of visual reference, are no longer present because of these various things. So I agree completely with what you're saying. You don't have, I'm walking towards that. There isn't a that to walk towards.
Yeah. One thing that I'd like to point out just quickly, sorry about that, these two gentlemen. I think Wall Street come in because of the water. It's the mode of transportation that start to come in. From the old days, people come by boat, but now we're so used to like adapting with the mainland, land-based mentality. That's something that we're losing, the charm of the geography, of what it is now. That's something that I like to point it out, for my culture, everything is about water. You come in by water, you travel by water, but now everything, since Alamana happened, it's the land base, it's the car, it's the freeway that Jack pointed out. When Jack was younger, there was a seaplane that landed on the ocean. That's how they communicate, I mean, they commute.
Well, no, you have to have the liners come in here. I mean, this was such an energy place in the forties and fifties with the Lurleen and the American President lines and all the lay cellars all around. This is an amazing scene, and that's just like totally dried up, and then, people would walk to the Young Hotel and then check in. Just a totally different,
Well, if you look at 19th century pictures too,
Yeah.
the
And
forest,
we
the
didn't-
forest.
we didn't
the mass.
mentioned that earlier, but that is a big part of the vitality of downtown as well, because the docks right here, the harbor, the reason downtown Honolulu was here is because the harbor's here.
Yes.
And so when everything was coming in and out of there, and that's not only all the passengers, that is also all the cargo. All the cargo has shifted to Sand Island because of containerization, so it doesn't happen here, and very few people come and go on ocean liners anymore because we all go by air. So that's gone. That necessity has been removed from downtown, therefore, Port Street doesn't get any of that.
Back to Martin's point too, this was not a very inhabited place by Hawaiians that live here in numbers. They preferred Waikiki because you could bring your canoe up on the sand. Here was not a good place for canoes.
no, they did live here. They
Not
lived,
very many.
no, they do want a stream. They had fresh water, and that was the city. And Waikiki was way off and not that populated, and you had the
This
swamp.
area wasn't popular.
No, because this is not downtown. Downtown was there. Right on where the Oahu market is. And when they tear down buildings there and they dig down for the foundations, they find fascinating things. Because that's where all the grass houses were, because you have fresh water. That's where the ships went with their rowboats to go up and get water at the waterfalls up there, because that was fresh water. They needed it. So this, Nu'uanu Stream is really the key to Honolulu, and it also kept the reef from growing with all that fresh water, so that the ships could actually get in here in a safe harbor. So the life of Honolulu is Nu'uanu Stream, and the ability to get over to the taro patches over on the other side of the island, and the incredible food supply that we had here, going all the way along King Street, Mount Makai, and then up into Manoa Valley, a huge food source here to supply ships. And it all happened right here, like a block and a half from where we're sitting.
It's all a sweet potato field over in here.
We've probably gone way beyond our allotted time. So we could stand and sit and talk forever and ever, but I don't think we're going to. So let's just bring it to an end. Thank you all for coming. This is a really nice audience. This is really engaging. Everybody got thought about things. And there's also old stuff to look at to remind you what it used to be, in addition to thinking about all the responsibilities we now have in this room. Every one of us has got to fix Fourth Street, so don't forget. Anyway, thank you all for being here. Thank you.
In the law about transportation on Fourth Street, we're gonna dive into it a little bit more. This is more like a planning side, but we're all connected one way or another. So safe transition. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Good, yeah, you can.
Well, sorry.